When we talk about empaths with few or no friends, we have to begin by understanding something most people miss. They are not avoiding connection, they are filtering it. An empath walks into a room and doesn't just see faces or hear voices. They feel emotional temperature, tension, hidden resentment, insecurity, excitement, fear. All of it hits their nervous system at once. For most people, social interaction is stimulating. For an empath, it can be overwhelming. That is why they don't collect relationships casually. They don't move through people the way others do. Every interaction leaves a trace, and over time, those traces add up. So when an empath pulls back from social life, it's not because they are cold or antisocial. It's because they've learned that too much emotional noise can drown out their inner voice. They know what it feels like to leave a gathering exhausted without being able to explain why. They know what it's like to absorb someone else's anxiety, anger, or sadness and carry it home like it belongs to them. And once you've experienced that enough times, you start to become selective, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. Empaths don't filter people by status, popularity, or convenience. They filter by emotional safety. They are constantly, often unconsciously, asking one question: do I feel calm when I'm around this person? If the answer is no, the connection doesn't last. It doesn't matter how funny, successful, or interesting someone is. If their energy is chaotic, manipulative, or emotionally unstable, the empath's system will reject it. This is why their social circle tends to shrink over time. As they grow more aware of their own needs, they stop tolerating relationships that cost more than they give. And this is where many misunderstandings happen. To the outside world, it looks like the empath is becoming distant, aloof, even lonely. But on the inside, something very different is happening. They are creating space for peace. They are choosing fewer connections so they can have deeper, cleaner, more honest ones. They would rather have one conversation that feels real than 10 that feel draining. They would rather sit in silence than sit in emotional chaos. This filtering also explains why empaths often feel misunderstood. People may interpret their boundaries as rejection, when in reality those boundaries are simply protection. An empath who steps back is not saying, "I don't care." They are saying, "I care so much that I can't afford to lose myself in this." That distinction is everything. So when you see an empath with very few friends, don't assume they are broken or lonely. Understand that they have refined their social world down to what their nervous system can actually hold. They are not isolating. They are curating. And in a world that constantly pulls, demands, and drains, that kind of filtering is not weakness. It is emotional intelligence in its purest form. Sometimes having fewer people in your life is exactly how you finally start hearing yourself. There's another layer to why empaths often end up with fewer people around them, and it has nothing to do with being antisocial. It has everything to do with perception. Empaths don't just listen to what people say, they feel what people mean. They pick up on the slight hesitation before a compliment, the tension behind a polite smile, the emotional mismatch between words and energy. While others may be comforted by surface-level harmony, the empath senses when something underneath is unsettled, dishonest, or misaligned. And once you can feel that, it becomes impossible to ignore. This means that in many social spaces, empaths are not actually relaxed. They're aware of the unspoken competition, the hidden insecurities, the subtle power games, the quiet resentments. They notice when someone is being friendly but not sincere, when laughter is masking jealousy, when kindness is being used as a strategy instead of a feeling. To most people, these things pass unnoticed. To an empath, they are loud. And when you constantly walk into rooms that feel emotionally noisy, you naturally start wanting to leave them. This is why empaths often seem like they don't fit into normal social circles. It's not because they don't like people. It's because they don't like pretending. They don't want to play along with conversations that feel fake or relationships that are built on convenience instead of connection. They don't enjoy being around people who say one thing and feel another. That emotional contradiction creates tension inside them, and over time, they learn that protecting their peace means walking away from environments that require emotional dishonesty. There's also something else that happens when you see beneath the surface. You start to lose interest in shallow dynamics. Gossip becomes exhausting. Small talk feels empty. Social rituals that are meant to impress or compete feel pointless. The empath isn't superior to this, but they are sensitive to how hollow it can be. They crave authenticity, even if it's uncomfortable. They'd rather sit with someone who is raw and real than with a room full of people who are performing. So as their awareness deepens, their tolerance for emotional theater drops. They stop forcing themselves into spaces that don't feel true. They stop chasing belonging in places where they have to wear a mask. And naturally, their circle gets smaller. But what they lose in quantity, they gain in clarity. They begin to recognize who actually sees them, who actually feels them, who actually shows up with honesty instead of strategy. This can be lonely at times because most people are not used to being seen that clearly. Being around an empath can feel exposing. It can feel like being gently but deeply understood, even when you haven't said much. And not everyone is comfortable with that level of emotional transparency. Some people pull away, not because the empath did anything wrong, but because being truly seen can be unsettling. So when an empath ends up with few friends, it's often because their ability to see truth naturally filters out pretense. And when the masks fall away, only what is real remains. Another reason empaths so often find themselves with only a small circle, or sometimes no circle at all, is because of how deeply they experience connection. For them, relationships are not built on routine or convenience. They are built on emotional resonance. While many people bond over shared activities, shared humor, or shared history, empaths bond over shared inner worlds. They want to know what moves you, what hurts you, what you hope for when no one is watching. That level of depth is not something you can fake, and it's not something most people are comfortable offering in everyday social life. Much of what passes for connection stays on the surface. People talk about work, about trends, about other people, about what happened yesterday. And that has its place. But to an empath, those conversations can feel like standing at the door of a house without ever being invited inside. They don't just ant to know what you did. They want to know how it affected you. They don't just want to hear the story. They want to feel the meaning behind it. When that depth is missing, something inside them remains untouched. And over time, untouched connection starts to feel like no connection at all. This is why shallow bonds don't satisfy an empath. They may be surrounded by people and still feel alone because none of those interactions are reaching the part of them that longs to be seen. They don't crave constant company. They crave understanding. They crave moments where someone is willing to slow down, open up, and meet them in emotional truth. Without that, being around others can feel more isolating than being by themselves. And because that depth is rare, empaths don't form many lasting bonds. They are not interested in maintaining relationships just for the sake of having them. If a connection never moves beyond surface level politeness, it quietly fades. Not out of judgment, but out of emotional mismatch. It's not that the other person did something wrong. It's that the empath needs more than what's being offered. This often creates a strange pattern in their lives. They may go long stretches without close friends, then suddenly form one incredibly intense, meaningful bond. They don't collect people, they recognize them. When someone finally meets them at that deeper level, the connection can feel almost instant, as if two inner worlds have finally found each other. But because those moments are rare, so are the relationships to the outside world. This can look like social withdrawal. But what's really happening is emotional precision. Empaths would rather have no one than have people who only know the surface of them. They would rather be alone with their thoughts than surrounded by conversations that never touch their heart. This depth is not a flaw. It is the core of who they are. But in a fast, distracted, emotionally guarded world, it naturally leads to a smaller circle. Because when you refuse to settle for shallow connection, you end up waiting longer for something real. And when something real finally arrives, it's worth every moment of the silence that came before. There is also a history behind the quietness of many empaths, and it's not a gentle one. Most of them didn't start out guarded. They started out open. They cared deeply, trusted easily, and gave more than they knew how to protect. They were the ones who listened when others needed to talk, who stayed when others walked away, who absorbed emotional pain because they didn't want anyone else to feel alone. And for a while, that generosity felt like love. But over time, it turned into exhaustion. Empaths often find themselves in relationships where they give far more than they receive. They attract people who need healing, support, understanding, and emotional labor. And because the empath can feel what others feel, they step in, even when it costs them. They try to fix, soothe, to hold things together. But not everyone gives back with the same care. Some people take and never look back. Some grow comfortable being carried. Some mistake empathy for unlimited availability. And that's how emotional burnout begins. When you've been used, misunderstood, or emotionally drained enough times, something changes inside you. You don't become bitter, but you do become aware. You start noticing the early signs of imbalance. You feel when a conversation is one-sided, when your energy is being pulled but not returned, when you are giving from a place that is slowly emptying you. And instead of pushing through it like you used to, you stop. This is where many empaths begin to be labeled as distant or detached. But what they are really doing is protecting what was once too freely given. They are no longer willing to sacrifice their peace just to keep a connection alive. They've learned that love without respect becomes self-abandonment, and they refuse to repeat that lesson again. So they become selective, not because they are closed off, but because they know what it costs to be open. They don't jump into new relationships quickly. They watch, they listen, they feel. They wait to see if the emotional exchange is balanced. And if it isn't, they quietly step back. This is why their solitude is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like loneliness, but from the inside, it feels like relief. It feels like not having to hold someone else's emotional weight all the time. It feels like not having to explain, justify, or give more than they have. It feels like finally being able to breathe. Empaths don't avoid people because they don't care. They avoid patterns that hurt them. They avoid dynamics where their kindness is exploited. They avoid relationships where their depth is taken for granted. And once you've learned how painful it is to lose yourself in someone else's needs, you don't easily forget it. So their small circle is not an accident. It is a boundary shaped by experience. And sometimes staying alone is the bravest way to stay whole. There is a quiet strength in the way empaths spend time alone, and it's often misunderstood. Many people see solitude as something to escape, something that must be filled with noise, activity, or constant interaction. But for an empath, being alone is not emptiness. It is where they come back to themselves. After absorbing so many emotions, expectations, and energies from the world, solitude becomes a kind of emotional home, a place where their nervous system can finally settle. Empaths are deeply self-connected. They notice what they feel. They reflect on why they feel it. They sit with their inner experiences instead of running from them. This means they don't need constant external stimulation to feel alive or valuable. They don't need an audience to confirm their worth. Their sense of self comes from an inner relationship, not just from how others respond to them. And because of that, they are far less dependent on social approval than most people. This independence changes how they approach relationships. They don't look for people to complete them or distract them from themselves. They look for people who can meet them, not replace them. They don't cling to connections out of fear of being alone because they are already at home in their own presence. That makes them selective. And sometimes that makes them solitary. It also makes them hard to manipulate. When you are deeply connected to yourself, you can feel when something is off. You don't ignore your intuition just to keep someone close. You don't betray your own feelings just to belong. An empath who is comfortable alone is not desperate for validation, and desperation is what keeps many people stuck in unhealthy relationships. The empath would rather sit with their own thoughts than sit in a situation that feels wrong. This self-connection is why they can go long stretches without many friends and still feel grounded. They use that time to process, to create, to understand themselves more deeply. They turn inward not because they are broken, but because that is where their clarity lives. And the more clarity they have, the less they are willing to accept connections that confuse or diminish them. Of course, this doesn't mean empaths don't want love or friendship. They do, but they want it to be real. They want it to be aligned. They want it to feel like an extension of their inner peace, not a disruption of it. So they wait. They don't rush. They let people reveal who they are over time in a world that teaches people to seek themselves through others. The empath does the opposite. They seek themselves first, and that changes everything. It changes who they allow close. It changes what they tolerate. It changes how many people they truly need. So when you see an empath walking alone, don't assume they are missing something. Often they are simply in conversation with the part of themselves that most people never learn to hear. And that inner connection is what makes their solitude feel full. What ultimately shapes the small, carefully chosen circle of an empath is their deep sensitivity to alignment. They don't wait for something to fall apart before they notice it's wrong. They feel the shift long before it becomes visible. A change in tone, a subtle emotional withdrawal, a quiet lack of respect, and something inside them knows. While others might rationalize it away or hope it will get better, the empath feels the truth immediately, and that truth becomes impossible to unfeel. This is why they often leave relationships earlier than most people would. Not because they are impulsive, but because they are attuned. They don't need dramatic conflict to tell them something isn't right. They don't need betrayal or cruelty to justify stepping back. Emotional misalignment alone is enough. If a connection no longer feels honest, safe, or mutual, they quietly begin to let go. To someone who doesn't live in that level of emotional awareness, this can look cold. It can look like they didn't care enough to try, but the opposite is usually true. Empaths care so deeply that they refuse to let something slowly rot into resentment. They know what it's like to stay too long in relationships that drain them, confuse them, or slowly erase who they are. And they have learned that leaving early when something no longer feels right is often the most compassionate choice for everyone involved. This instinct to choose alignment over attachment is why their lives often have long periods of solitude. They don't fill space just to avoid being alone. They don't cling to people out of fear. If a relationship doesn't feel emotionally clean, they would rather walk alone than stay and betray themselves. And that kind of integrity naturally leads to fewer connections, but stronger ones. It also means they are incredibly loyal to the people who do align with them. When an empath finds someone who feels safe, sincere, and emotionally present, they invest deeply. They don't take that connection for granted because they know how rare it is. Their loyalty is not loud, but it is profound. It shows up in listening, in consistency, and emotional availability. But it only exists where there is mutual respect and honesty. So when those conditions fade, they don't fight to keep something that no longer reflects who they are. They release it, not with anger, but with clarity. They understand that staying in misalignment is a form of self-abandonment, and they have already done too much of that in the past. This is why their small circle is not something to be pitied. It is something to be respected. Every person in it earned their place through emotional truth, not convenience. Every connection survived the empath's sensitivity, not despite it. And in a world that often chooses comfort over honesty, the empath chooses truth, even when it means walking alone.